So what I want to do is just briefly show quo primum here on the screen, because it's actually the document quo primum that is in question. That's where we find this language. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, there is sometimes an erroneous view that it is the Council of Trent that promulgated the Missal of Pius V, what's erroneously called the Latin Mass. That's incorrect. The Council of Trent, in and of itself, by its own authority, did not promulgate this missal. It was actually a pope, Pope Pius V. Again, that's why we call it the Missal of Pius V. It was the Pope, on his own authority, that issued the document promulgating the Latin Mass. In the document quo primum, which was several years after the Council of Trent, very similar to the situation with Paul VI with the new Roman Missal. The Second Vatican Council did call for some liturgical reforms, but it wasn't Vatican II that actually, on its own authority, implemented the liturgy. It was rather the Pope, several years after the council closed, who promulgated the new missal on his own authority. Of course, the other bishops accepted it. So it's not by his own authority alone, but it is initially on his own authority, and the other bishops accepted it. So it's more on papal authority that the missal was promulgated. But likewise, for the Missal of Pius V, again, what's often called the Latin Mass, that is an initiative, or at least a authority, I should say, of the Pope rather than the council itself. So I do want to correct that misunderstanding here. And of course, we do know that the Roman Rite had undergone all kinds of all kinds of revisions, all kinds of changes, alterations, significant ones, from the time of the Masses of the Apostles unto 1570 with quo primum. It had undergone very significant alterations. I mean, if you just think about it, some of the earliest liturgies were very, very mixed with Jewish rites, and the services would have looked very, very different, especially as they're connected with agape feasts in the early New Covenant period. And so you can see some pretty significant deviations from that in all of our liturgies, not just the Roman Rite, but the Byzantine Rite and everything else. There have been significant changes to all of our rites, including the Roman Rite. So I also want to correct the misunderstanding that somehow the missal that Pius V promulgates here, again, the Latin Mass, is somehow the Mass of the Apostles, or it's always been done this way. That's just certainly not the case. There have been significant alterations. There was a period in time where there wasn't even a Roman canon. So even the Roman canon itself, which many consider to be the heart of this missal, is itself not something that goes back to the apostles. Now, I don't think it's a bad thing. I love the Roman canon. I prefer the Roman canon. But I'm just saying that we don't need to have some misunderstandings on what was promulgated here. There have been many alterations. So you do see language, as you can see on the screen, that Pius V is promulgating this missal that we, again, often call the Latin Mass. He says, furthermore, by these presents this law in virtue of our apostolic authority, we grant and concede in perpetuity that for the chanting or reading of the Mass in any church whatsoever, this missal is hereafter to be followed absolutely without any scruple of conscience or fear and incurring any penalty and so on. But you can see the language of in perpetuity there. And there were plenty of other churches that had different liturgical rites, many of which gave way then to the Roman liturgy. Some preserved some of their liturgies that were older than 200 years, which the Apostolic Constitution here does allow them to do, but many gave way to their own liturgical traditions to embrace the Roman Missal. But again, you have that language of in perpetuity. So does that somehow mean that this could never be altered? Well, in reality, Pope Pius V, who's issuing this document, did not read it that way, because Pius V himself made alterations to this very missal after 1570 when this was promulgated. So the very Pope who promulgated this made alterations himself. Not only that, but successor popes, many popes, made alterations to this missal. So they did not read quo primum as somehow saying this is in perpetuity. It can't be altered in any kind of way. It's just set and that's it. When it comes to promulgating law, the in perpetuity here is unless the lawgiver himself reverses it or makes an alteration. In other words, it's only the Pope that could alter this. You could never have a bishop or something like that altering the missal of Pius V. It would be the lawgiver himself who can adjust something. Otherwise, it's in perpetuity. Think of it like this. Let's look at Leviticus 16:34. This is the Day of Atonement, where Leviticus 16 is talking all about all kinds of sacrifices, animal sacrifices, and all kinds of prescriptions of what's to take place in the temple. And it says this, and this is not the only place, by the way, this is just one. This shall be an everlasting statute for you. Notice the term everlasting, to make atonement for the people of Israel once in the year for all their sins. And Moses did as the Lord had commanded him. So you're seeing the question of this institution of these liturgical sacrifices, animal sacrifices. It's an everlasting statute. Well, as Christians, we don't do these things anymore, right? And for good reason. Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice and the fulfillment of these things. But somebody will point out, but wait, it's an everlasting statute. Yes, it's an everlasting statute, meaning that nobody other than the lawgiver can alter this. But the lawgiver himself can alter it. The lawgiver cannot bind himself to never alter something. That's absurd. If he binds other people to this in an everlasting statute, he still has the authority to reverse that or undo it because he's the lawgiver. Likewise with popes, a pope cannot bind a successor pope on a matter of liturgical discipline. You could have a pope binding successor popes to a matter of dogma, but the issuing of a missal is not a matter of dogma. It's a matter of liturgical discipline. So the rubrics, things like that, that's liturgical discipline. Those may point to dogma, but they themselves are not dogmatic. They can be altered, which, again, Pius V altered and other successor popes altered because they realized these things can be altered. Now, in the case, again, of the Old Covenant's institution and liturgical sacrifices, the lawgiver is God, right? Well, God himself reversed that. God himself undid this. So we're no longer bound to this as an everlasting statute. Likewise, when it comes to the in perpetuity language, the Pope is the one who promulgated and bound the church to accept this. However, it was a successor Pope who undid that and altered the missal, Paul VI. And the Pope can do that. He has that authority. He is the lawgiver. Moreover, many of the preconciliar popes, again, including Pius V himself, altered it. So none of the popes understood that popes were somehow bound to, in perpetuity, never alter this missal. That was never understood to be what he intended. I want to read something to you here from James Lacutus's book, The Pope, the Council, and the Mass, where he has an entire chapter dedicated to this question of quo primum and can the Mass be altered? And he says this, quoting Father Jungmann: some real changes since the 16th century in the rubrics and in the text of the Missal of Pius V have resulted in certain instances from papal orders. For instance, in the new edition of the Missal under Clement VIII, 1604, the biblical chant pieces, which in some printings have been arbitrarily changed in favor of the new Vulgate, were restored to their original state, and new regulations were made regarding the final blessing. In another edition, the Mass book under Urban VIII, The wording of the rubrics was greatly improved, and the revision of the hymns, already accomplished in the breviary, was carried out also in the few hymns of the missal. The new edition, with any notable changes, came out till that of 1920, which contained the revisions based on the reform of Pope Pius X. For the rest, excepting the increase in saints' feasts, very little was done to the accepting the increase in saints' feasts, very little was done to affect the arrangement of the Mass. Pope Clement XIII prescribed the preface of the Holy Trinity for Sundays, and Pope Leo XIII ordered the prayers said after Lone Mass. These are just a few instances. But again, from Pius V himself to plenty of successor popes, you have all kinds of alterations made to this missal, of which it said, this is it in perpetuity and is to be followed in perpetuity without any scruple. But yes, that's to be followed in perpetuity unless the lawgiver, that is the Pope, alters it. And many of the popes did. There's an interesting parallel here, a very interesting parallel, because the language that we find here of in perpetuity is also found in the suppression of the Jesuits. We know for a while the Pope suppressed the Jesuits, and in the document suppressing the Jesuits, he uses that same language. But obviously, a successor Pope reversed that. So in perpetuity did not mean that somehow a future Pope could not reverse that. Now, there's some additional language towards the end of the document of quo primum. It says, therefore, no one whosoever is permitted to alter this notice of our permission, statute, ordinance, command, precept, grant, indult, declaration, will, decree, and prohibition. Would anyone, however, presume to commit such an act, he should know that he will incur the wrath of Almighty God and the blessed apostles Peter and Paul. And some will point out this and say, well, look, see, you can't have any kind of alterations to this missal. That's true for anyone below a pope. Anyone below a pope cannot alter this missal, and they would incur the wrath of Almighty God and blessed apostle Peter and Paul if they did. However, that doesn't mean the lawgiver himself can't alter it. The lawgiver himself can, because the lawgiver can't bind himself to successor. He can't bind successor lawgivers. They're of equal authority in matters of discipline. So this intention here of this language was for anyone other than the Pope, that is the lawgiver.
Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button. God bless.